Afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us in the Onward Hub this afternoon for this very important discussion. I know that many people will be extremely tired from the various tribulations and concentrations and of conference and the Midland Bar and otherwise. So thank you very much for coming along for what I hope is going to be a very interesting session today. My name is Gavin Rice. I'm the head of political economy at Onward. And today we are going to be talking about how to achieve UK energy abundance, which is rather a wide topic. So there's plenty of scope for speakers to take things off in various different directions, and hopefully we should have a good discussion today. So Britain is facing, I don't think it's an underestimate to say, an energy crisis with some of Europe's highest costs. A third of energy-intensive industry has been lost in 3 years. We have the highest industrial energy costs in the developed world, as of statistics out a couple of weeks ago, and I believe the second highest domestic costs. This is incredibly damaging for the UK economy, for growth, for production, but also lies at the heart of the cost of living crisis as well, and therefore has extremely deep and wide political salience. I'm very happy to be joined today by an excellent panel of speakers. So on my immediate right, I have Lord Houchin, who does not require much by way of introduction. You'll be familiar with his work, Mayor of Tees Valley, of course, first elected in 2017, re-elected in 2021 and 2024, has overseen the development of Teesside Airport, established a free port alongside a wide range of achievements for that part of the world, and is arguably our most senior elected Conservative. So thank you very much for being here, Ben. On my immediate left, I have Juliet Samuel, who is a columnist at The Times and has written very widely on this subject, but also more broadly on questions of economics, finance, and industrial policy, alongside many other topics. To her left, I have Nick Timothy, my dear friend, who is the MP for West Suffolk, of course, former Downing Street Chief of Staff, and a prolific author, writer, and thinker. And then to my far right, I have Ryan Chadwitton, who is an energy and technology analyst and also writes for The Telegraph. Speakers will have approximately 5 minutes to give their introductory thoughts on the question of how we've got to where we are and what steps this government, but also crucially a future Conservative government, would need to take in order to move the UK from its current situation to one tool of energy abundance. Just by way of housekeeping, they will speak for a few minutes each. Then I will share a little bit of managed discussion, and then we will come to the audience for Q&A. There will be roving mics that members of the team will bring around. If you have a question, please raise your hand, try to catch my eye, and give your name and organisation if you have one. Do wait for the microphones to come to you because we are live streaming it today. We will finish exactly on the hour. So I'm going to start by coming to you, Ben. Obviously, you've got really crucial, direct, lived experience, to coin a phrase, of the economic issues facing your part of the world, but also the role that energy has played in that and energy costs. So talk to us a little bit about your experience. What are the challenges that businesses are facing and what needs to change?
Yeah, thanks, Gavin, and appreciate Onward for inviting me to this, and thank you for the very nice introduction. You did miss out that Simon Clarke, obviously of Onward Now Heritage, was key in that as one of the local MPs. And
Simon waved at us.
Hugely disappointed to lose Simon at the election, but no doubt we'll be back and back stronger at the next election, and I look forward to it. Yeah, Teesside. I think what Teesside is a microcosm of the problem in the UK. So I've got kind of 4 or 5 points that outline when I think of the major issues for energy policy within the UK, or the problem with energy pricing, and then the solution really is in the title of the Onward panel. So number one, investment's a real issue. So what we're seeing, and actually in the broader economy, lack of investment in the UK, whether that be for tax policy, wider regulatory policy. But when we're trying to speak to investors to come to, say, Teesside, a lot of them very energy intensive investors, the single number one question they always ask now is energy pricing. And as soon as you tell them that the energy price is now averaging 25 pence a kilowatt hour, you find it very difficult to have a conversation beyond that point. And just to give some people an idea, because that's just an abstract number for many, if you go to places in the Middle East, and in particular North America now, that price can be as low as sometimes 2 or 3 pence a kilowatt hour. The Middle East, 5 pence a kilowatt hour. So you're, somewhere between 5 and nearly 10 times more expensive than other parts of the world, with globally mobile capital that doesn't have to come to the UK, doesn't have to come to Europe, it can go anywhere in the world. And so you actually get to a place where that conversation continues to happen. You create a bit of a doom loop that actually means that investment is even more sparse, and that has a huge impact on demand for energy, which then has an impact on supply. Supply is massively impacted by policy, and I think it's fair to say both under the last few years of the previous Conservative government, and particularly accelerated under this government, the policy direction of net zero in particular has caused a hugely damaging effect on the cost of that energy. And it also comes up with some really perverse outcomes. So, yes, introduced sadly under the Conservative government, and unintended consequences of things like the ZEV mandate, where you have cars now being mandated to be sold that have to be EV by car manufacturers, and if they don't hit that target, for every car they don't sell above that target, they get fined on average between £15,000 and £20,000 a car. You know, that we'll see if that continues. Nissan, Jaguar Land Rover and all other car manufacturers in this country leave us. The unintended consequences of planning regime. You know, we talk about, well, Ed Miliband is zealous about the 2030 target. Let's just put this to bed, right? It is impossible to decarbonise by 2030. Forget the hopes and dreams of carbon capture and hydrogen and solar and onshore wind. Physical infrastructure that needs to go into the ground to be able to deal with the intermittency, to put the pylons up, the cables in the ground, the substations that need to be built, it will not happen. Because not only are you doing it once, you're doing it dozens of times up and down the country. You still have to go through DCOs. The government don't seem to be reforming that in the way that needs to happen. You're going to be, if you're lucky, 3 years down the line, probably 4 or more years down the line before you get through a DCO with all of the challenges that are attached. You're never doing anything by putting a spade in the ground at the earliest. 2029, you're certainly not decarbonising by 2030. That has a huge impact on supply chains of where you're getting the substations on, where you're getting the cables from, where you're getting the people to do all of this. And what this government is doing is accelerating towards a 2030 target that it must know, and I think, don't want to put words in other people's mouths on the panel, but I'd be amazed if people on this panel didn't agree, is inevitable that we're going to hit that wall and that 2030 target is going to be missed. Taxpayers' cost and contribution to the subsidy and the supply of electricity and the mass socialisation of that supply is going to continue. And the consequence of all of this is sadly what we've seen in Teesside over many, many decades, but accelerated because of this policy. Just in recent months, we've seen SABIC, a huge Saudi Arabian company that have owned the cracker on Teesside since 2006, close that business. They were partway through investing $400 million in the rebuild of that cracker for a different fuel use into polyethylene. They've decided it is more commercially useful to them to write off the nearly £300 million that they've spent, or $300 million, sorry, and continue to invest with INEOS in Europe on a new £3 billion cracker because of the regulation and energy cost in this country. We have a bizarre position now where a company called Ensus on Teesside, another chemical manufacturer of ethanol already pretty unproductive in this country, but we're seeing a position where the UK government have opened tariff-free ethanol into this country from the US, which some may say is a good thing. I'll leave others to comment on that. But the perverse nature of that result is that Ensus are now in discussions with government to get subsidy to protect themselves from the tariff-free arrangements that they've just created with the US. And largely not because of the ethanol, because they're not that bothered about the ethanol, but the byproduct of CO2 that's needed to go into health, into food, and into the cooling of nuclear power stations across this country. We've seen steel manufacturers close. We've seen places like Scunthorpe on the brink because of energy pricing and carbon pricing. All of these problems are going to continue. We're seeing a chemical manufacturer and processing business close on average once a month at the moment. And that is not going to change. We're going to see thousands of job losses, and we are stopping the ability of this country to make the things that make things. That exposes us on a geopolitical basis, it exposes us from a national security basis. And I believe the only way to tackle this, which is, as ever, Onward hit this on the head with the conversation that we're having today. And it's something that, if anybody's interested, they should go and watch. Chris Wright, who is the Energy Secretary in the US, I don't know why, but I found myself one night watching his confirmation hearing after the election. I wouldn't encourage people to do that on a regular basis. But it's a really interesting example of how the American system is misconstrued, and it's something we should be following much more closely. That they're not anti-renewables, they're not anti-onshore wind or solar. What they are pro is energy abundance. They are pro more forms of energy of all kinds to make sure that we're internationally competitive. And he made a really interesting statement, which I completely agree with and which I'll end on. The Americans think that the whole of the future economy, the global economy, is going to be about who can produce the most energy in the cheapest form. Doesn't matter what kind it is, who's going to win that race. And they believe if they don't win that race with China, that then means that China are the supreme power in this world. The UK and Europe are not at the races. We're tinkering around the edges of transition. We're overseeing deindustrialisation. We're overseeing the intrusion of the Chinese manufacturers and market into the UK, which further exposes us. And the only way to protect us is to get real on gas, on nuclear, on onshore, on offshore, on all forms of energy, rather than what we're doing at the minute. And Ed Miliband is pursuing zealously, which is picking not just winners and losers, but just picking many, many losers in the market, which ultimately means all of your prices are going to go up. Industrial prices are going to continue to rise, job losses are going to continue to rise, and this country absolutely finds itself in a massive, massive crisis.
Ben, thank you very much. Juliet, you've written a lot on this subject over the years, and obviously we've seen the Overton window shift quite a lot only in recent weeks. How do you see this whole question?
So I'm going to talk first about the conceptual mistake we've made with the carbon transition, and then, what a path out of that would look like. So firstly, fundamentally, we've made the same mistake in energy as we've made in most other supply of goods and services that we want people to have, like housing or childcare, which is to subsidize people to buy the energy or to cap the price of it while strangling the supply of it. And unsurprisingly, prices have shot up as a result. And we've done this by essentially treating, an energy transition as a matter of targets. And this is effectively like saying, the best analogy I've heard on this is basically to compare this to a body. And say you want to replace the supply of blood in a body. From red blood, you want it to go to green blood. The approach we've taken is essentially to say, what we're going to do is set a cap on the amount of red blood that can flow around this body. And if the body finds at various points that there's not enough blood supply to keep certain organs going or even certain limbs, then it just has to shut those down and get that function elsewhere. When, obviously the way you should think of an energy transition is as a blood transfusion. And if you think of this in that way, it becomes obvious that if you start to limit the amount of blood that can flow around, you're going to cause serious damage. What you actually would need to do is to build up an abundant supply of, say, green blood, if that's what you want, and then slowly and gradually transition the body from one supply to the other. And you would have to prepare the body for that by, changing various things about the way it functions, do it slowly, see where things are going wrong, correct those mistakes. But obviously that's not the way we've done it. And so instead we're seeing absolutely massive damage to the body, which is, the lifeblood of our economy, essentially. We've lost 70% of steel output since before the pandemic. We've lost a fifth of chemicals output. Cement production has gone down to its lowest level since 1950. And we've seen iconic sites, like Grangemouth and Port Talbot, from the dawn of the Industrial Revolution closing. And on top of that, the impact that we've had on carbon emissions is obviously minimal across the world. And in fact, it's estimated that about half of the reduction in carbon emissions that this country has been achieved by moving production offshore to places where they almost certainly are using dirtier fuel and having all sorts of other environmental impacts that we choose not to look at. So this is self-sabotage on an epic scale. And as to what energy policy in the UK has looked like for the past 10 to 20 years, essentially, we've gone from over the coalition years, you've seen continued shutdown of coal. You've seen a ridiculous, unreal debate about nuclear in which this party insisted you needed to have the private sector in the market create nuclear power plants, which has never happened in the history of the world for obvious reasons, which is that if a nuclear power plant goes wrong, it's a societal-wide issue. And you've replaced coal with renewables, which are intermittent, which take up vast amounts of land, and which require investment in the grid and in storage, which they do not bear the cost of. So although the marginal cost of production of electricity from a solar or a wind farm has, fallen massively, and that's very impressive, and that's a technological success, they're not reflecting the cost of investment that's required to completely change the way our grid functions. And we saw in Spain what happens when you transition your whole power system without changing your grid. And must be a significant chance of a similar event happening in this country, which essentially the government is in denial about. So then you look at oil and gas and domestic production of oil and gas. So, the North Sea, yes, it's a declining basin, and it was probably never going to suddenly flood us with energy in the way that it did in the 80s. But its decline has been massively accelerated by a series of policies, the first of which was George Osborne treating it as a cash cow. And that was just to extract a few billion in revenue. It had a disproportionate impact on investment. And then, followed by a whole series of litigation under the auspices of the Climate Change Act, which essentially brought to a halt investment in new discoveries and new fields and led to a massive exodus from the North Sea by all sorts of companies. And the irony, of course, is that the more domestic or European piped gas production we shut down, the more we end up shipping in LNG from abroad, which is thought to have about 6 times the carbon emissions of piped gas. And the more that we're relying on oil and gas extraction processes, which are, in many parts of the world, verifiably dirtier and less carefully monitored than we would have in the North Sea. But apparently what you can't see doesn't hurt you. So what should we do? Well, firstly, we should stop overtaxing and shutting down Europe's own supply. We could start with the North Sea. We should let investment flow. We should encourage investment to flow and see what we can get out of it. And then we should similarly across Europe have a relentless campaign to encourage other European countries to do the same. Europe, actually, the Netherlands shut down what's thought to be the biggest gas field in the world in the last few years, Groningen in the north of the Netherlands, just as Russia was cutting off supply. And the climate lobby has convinced Europe that it can't move the dial with its own supply. And it's true that we're never going to have, decades worth of new supply coming online in Europe, but we can help ourselves to, transition to a new energy system if that's what we want by turning on all the taps, Stop banning fracking, stop banning development of new fields, and make the most of what we have. And in fact, there have been significant new discoveries in the Eastern Med, particularly in the last few years. There's a massive field discovered off Cyprus, which could probably, at least partially replace a lot of the Russian gas, which we're instead doing by shipping LNG across the Atlantic Ocean. So no climate person has ever been able to explain to me why it's better for us to ship LNG across the Atlantic rather than to exploit what we have here. Secondly, this hopefully would buy us time to establish a probably 1 to 2 decade program of commissioning nuclear power plants, which is what you would need to get costs down, because you need to develop a supply chain. For that, you need predictability. To get financing, you need, an assurance that the government is going to keep commissioning these things, and possibly you could, bring in the foreign company to help you do this. We've had EDF, but the best in the world at doing this seems to be KEPCO, the South Korea's state nuclear company, and perhaps look at the Asian model, whereby you get a foreign company in and then you force them to over time localize their supply chain and to build back up the skills base that we have so recklessly destroyed. And then on the other nuclear side with small modular reactors, we've had this 10-year saga, it's ridiculous, of will we or won't we commission Rolls-Royce to build some of these new reactors that we think are so great. Finally, we've made a decision, yes, but we've only commissioned 2 of them. And, they need a supply guarantee of about 50 to build a factory. So we should be commissioning 10, so that they have a good basis to sell abroad, with an assurance of more to come if things are on track. Third thirdly, we should be investing more in new energy production and storage in which the UK may have an advantage. Some of these things may not look viable right now, but that doesn't, but many technologies at first look very expensive. So you could look at hydrogen, tidal, geothermal. There's been a lot of talk about fusion, and start to build up on the future, for the next generation of energy supply. And at the same time, you should be looking on the demand side. It's insulating buildings, but it's also things like photonics chips, which are, semiconductors which use light instead of electricity. They're much more energy efficient. Europe has an innovative advantage between the UK and Germany in terms of producing them. But we've just allowed a UK company that does these chips to be bought with Chinese financing. So we're clearly not thinking very strategically. So that is our plan to get out of what Donald Trump calls our road to hell.
Juliet, thank you. Yes, by all means. By all means. So the short version is we should have done absolutely everything differently. And I think the Irish expression is you wouldn't start from here. Nick, we'll come to you.
Well, thank you. And how do I follow Bell and Juliet? Those were brilliant opening remarks. I wanted to say a few things about the actual absurdities of the policies we're talking about when we talk about net zero and the Miliband agenda, which I'm afraid did start in 2008 with the Climate Change Act, but was continued through our time in office, but gets worse under Ed Miliband now. And then I thought I'd say something about a broader thing about why this matters in broader economic terms. Ben mentioned the Z mandate. We are fining companies, we're threatening to fine companies for producing too much of their own goods. I mean, just think about that. That's what we're doing to our manufacturers. Manufacture too much of what you produce, and you will be fined. The World Bank has published research and actually has a brilliant map which shows the countries that are the best and the worst for solar panel across the world. Britain and Ireland are given their own colours because we are by far the worst countries in the world for solar, as anybody who lives in the British Isles knows. And yet the policy is to double solar by 2030, and solar is not only obviously eating up large parts of our high-quality farmland, but it's actually 4 times more carbon intensive than nuclear. We are making ourselves dependent partly as a result of that policy on intermittent renewables, solar and wind. And according to the government's own research, by 2030, we are going to be spending £8 billion a year on balancing costs. That is, to stop wind and solar companies from supplying power to the grid when it's too windy and too sunny, and to basically turn on power stations when it is not windy or sunny enough. £8 billion a year. We are continuing to subsidise tracks. A power station that has received £6.5 billion in subsidies so far to chop down 300 million trees, import them to Britain, they're turned into pellets and burned, and we pretend that that's environmentally friendly. In the North Sea, we are refusing to give new licences to companies to exploit the oil and gas reserves that we know exist. Instead, we are importing oil and gas taken from the same seabeds by Norwegian companies, giving them the profits, the jobs, the exports, the tax revenues, and then with those tax revenues, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund is buying up our assets because we think we are too green and too good to do it for ourselves. It is ridiculous. Ed Miliband says that all of this is to try to get us off the roller coaster of fossil fuel prices. But his solution to that is to lock in permanently high prices. As Claire Coutinho puts it, he's so nervous about the variability of a 4% variable mortgage. He wants to lock us in to a 10% fixed rate forever. It's bananas. And the more you look at these things, the madder it gets. Now, I'm really pleased with the things that we've said at this conference so far. We'd already said that we were coming off net zero. We've said that we are going to scrap the Climate Change Act. We've said that we will get rid of the carbon tax. All of that is very welcome. I think it's really important, though, that we put these series of policies into a broader context. And Ben and Juliet both talked about this. But the reason this is important ultimately is that our economic model is broken. We've run out of road. We have not grown on a per capita basis by 2% or more for 2 consecutive years since I was at university, which, as you can see from my head of hair, was quite a long time ago. We have run out of road. And we are running massive trade deficits. Outside the pandemic, we've run a massive trade deficit every year since 1998. And we've been sort of conditioned to say that this doesn't matter. It's an old-fashioned way of thinking. But actually, if you're not doing or making or selling enough of what the world needs, ultimately, that does bring problems home. Because what normally happens when you run a trade deficit is you get a current account deficit, and if you leave that be, then the value of your currency falls, and imports get more expensive. Everyone feels a bit poorer. The things that you make and sell get more competitive, and there's a kind of natural correction. We don't do that because we don't want to admit how poor we actually are in reality, and we are much poorer than we think we are. So to avoid that, we've become addicted to what we euphemistically call foreign investment. Now, lots of foreign investment is really worthwhile, and we're not arguing against that. But lots of this investment is actually rent-seeking. It's stripping assets in this country with the proceeds taken for the benefit of people elsewhere. We talk about things like Thames Water and the regulation of our utilities. Well, that was actually the decision of the Blair government to allow foreign private equity to start taking over our regulated utilities. The same is true about all sorts of things. Sovereign wealth funds buying up land and property and contributing to asset bubbles. You could go into any number of things, from the way we finance higher education by selling immigration, not education, all the way through to our own government debt. We are the ultimate double deficit country, a fiscal deficit and a trade deficit, and we are basically surviving today and staving off the reality of our situation at the expense of our children. And I think that is immoral. So to fix that, we've got to reindustrialise, we've got to export more. To do those things will require things that are tough, a whole series of different approaches to policy, more restrictive attitudes to foreign investment, a less naive approach to international trade, tax and regulatory reform, certainly planning reform. We need to reprofile our public spending so that there's less on the day-to-day and more on future investment. Incentives and grants for tech, plant and machinery, new approach to training and education, certainly for people after the age of 18. But most importantly, we need to completely change our energy policy, because you can't reindustrialise with the kind of industrial energy prices that we have. And I'm afraid, sitting in the House of Commons, over the last year or so, one of the recurring patterns that I've seen is Labour ministers coming to the House on a really regular basis to confirm the loss of strategically important industries and massive job losses, really, really hurting particular regions of our country. And they keep saying they'll have a plan to retrain people. They're softening the blow with a subsidy or an intervention, but they're not tackling the root causes of the problem. Decarbonisation, as pursued to date, has meant deindustrialisation, and we've got to stop that.
Nick, thank you. Ryan, we'll come to you last. You've written a lot on this topic, but particularly in relation to the energy needs of new technologies and new industries. How bad's the situation and what needs to change?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. And I think, to be a little optimistic, what's been said at this conference and the policy announcements have been made are very encouraging. Getting rid of renewable obligations contracts, replacing the Climate Change Act of 2008. I think when I started looking at energy, the Conservative Party was ideologically indistinguishable from Ed Miliband, I think. It is now quite distinguishable, right? It's a climate realist, pro-industry platform, all right? There's a lot, I think, that still needs to be covered. There is one particular molecule haunting the Midland Hotel. I think hydrogen, frankly, in terms of price, is not going to be competitive with gas for industrial heating anywhere in this century. And I think the recent strike prices from the hydrogen auction basically confirm that. And so I think when we're talking about, how do you decarbonize industrial heat to the extent that you do, it really is about electrification, all right? And the key to electrification, more than anything, is cheap electricity. Since about 2008, electricity has remained about 19% of Britain's calorific energy consumption every year. Just 20%, 1/5 of our energy consumption is electricity. But it's 45% of the overall energy expenditure, right? So that's a really important point to make. And if you're going to electrify with these prices, you're just going to have much, much more expensive energy. And, we've talked about how much our energy-intensive industries have declined. Well, they can still go lower, right? They've gone down by 1/3 since COVID. There's still 2/3 to go. Why did this consensus establish itself over the last 10 or 15 years or so? I think there was a very positive story to tell that if we did have these negative externalities and these losses of industrial jobs in the heartlands, they'd be replaced by green energy jobs. Unfortunately, that's just not materialized, right? And there are a couple of reasons for this. One, a lot of these so-called green energy jobs, the opportunity is either very small or has already gone to China, right? So the revenue from the manufacture of wind turbines and solar panels in Britain, that's turnover, not GVA. That's about 1 billion a year. That's less than the manufacture of pleasure boats. It's less than the manufacture of carpets and rugs. And it's about 1/4 of the turnover from the revenue of the fish and mollusk processing industry, right? So that's a green energy job. Those green energy sectors, or those labeled green energy, such as batteries and electric vehicles, that do have much larger opportunities, these are very dependent on having very cheap energy prices. Hence why China, the dominant manufacturer of electric vehicles and the dominant manufacturer of batteries, is also the dominant generator and consumer of coal. Now, when we talk about reindustrialization, as Timothy has, the sort of straw man accusation that will get thrown at people is that this is nostalgia, right? This is wanting to go back to the pre-Thatcherite era of, British Leyland or, nationalized British Steel. This, I think, is, a caricature, right? I don't think anyone is asking for manufacturing to be 30% of employment or 50% of gross value added. But it's only about 9% of GDP at present, and, not much of employment. We are really at the sharp end of deindustrialization versus other European countries and versus the United States even. And when you actually look at our energy-intensive sector, which is about 200 billion in turnover and about 60 billion in gross value added, it's about 2% of GDP, but only 1% of employment. And if industrial policy is to mean anything, it's moving jobs and workers from less productive sectors to more productive sectors where they can be higher value added. And when you factor that almost all of these jobs and almost all of this value is outside London, right? If you want to avoid a future where London and the South East is just funding, increasing deficits everywhere else in the country, you're going to have a strong industrial base. I think, on a kind of few tangential notes, I think Julia's right when we talk about nuclear power. We still don't really have an answer for how we're going to scale up nuclear without big state investments, right? We sort of, are trying to create sort of novel ideas around the private sector, maybe the use of free ports as sort of like plug-in environments where big consumers essentially build their own generation and are kind of locked out of the national grid. Maybe that can be a solution. But I think, unfortunately, increased state spending is going to have to be necessary if you want to deliver nuclear at scale. And then, of course, there are 1,000 regulatory issues that need to be dealt with, 1,000 planning regulations that also have to be dealt with as well. But they do have to be dealt with. And you've got, up to 2 to 4 years in order to find some really good policies which will actually do that. I think, on a final note, I think the Tory party is obviously, speaking as an independent here, the Tory party is at a bit of a low point in the polls. And obviously the last 14 years have made it difficult for you to immediately reshape your brand. However, I think there is an opening here. Labour have clearly decided that they're the party of foreign direct investment, come what may. Right? They sort of the party of like Google, Amazon, BlackRock, and so forth. Reform seem to have decided that they're the party of luxury apartments and crypto finance. And I think there is an opportunity here for the Conservatives to say we are the party of industrial production, right? Not one other political party, not the Lib Dems, not the Greens, not your party, is really presenting themselves to British-owned industrial production in order to make us more self-sufficient, to reduce the current account deficit, and to make the country more productive. So I think this is a real opportunity. It's one that comes with very significant sacrifices. It's one that comes with irritating a lot of people. But I think it's the best start to a full rebrand.
Ryan, thanks very much. Just briefly from me, just to come back to you, Ben. Obviously, net zero was a big part of the Conservative Party's political platform for a long time. The UK was very successful at decarbonising further and faster than any other comparable country onshore, but the measurement was the emissions produced here, and actually what people are talking about much more frequently now is what Juliet and Nick have been mentioning about the offshoring of emissions elsewhere. How has the party been on a journey such that it's come this far? Have the circumstances changed? Has the party changed? How do you see how do you see the politics of this?
Yeah, I do think the circumstances have changed. There was an opportunity of which, again, in large part, the Conservative government got very, very wrong. In the early days of the offshore wind industry, that, to be fair, the UK did create. We were the first starters in that market. We absolutely got ahead of the curve of pretty much every other nation. The one thing we didn't then solidify was that industrial base along with it. So without getting too technical, getting into the supply chain plans of how the likes of Ørsted or RWE or Equinor, who had the licenses, one, interesting that they're all foreign-owned licenses from the Crown rather than national, but even if you exempt that, the government said you have to present supply chain plans, and part of the process of being granted these licenses and getting the subsidy is that you've got to try and create UK content. Now, what was interesting actually in that, and this is both pre-Brexit and continued after Brexit, there are no teeth to any of the regulations. So what you found was, while there was a requirement for UK content, where most of the supply chain plans, if not all of the supply chain plans, didn't have UK content, everybody was penalised, so therefore nobody was penalised in the scheme. And so we had a great opportunity. We've had this with we had it with solar, we lost out. We've had it with offshore wind and onshore wind, we've lost out. We're going to lose out on, well, I mean, I don't disagree with Ryan actually, but hydrogen, there was an opportunity to do it at scale. It would have required significant investment. That boat has sailed. Other countries are doing it in a bigger way. We're not going to be able to solidify that supply chain either. So there were some good starts to trying to get these technologies, but when you look back, all of those ships have sailed. And then I think there's also a really important geopolitical point in this. This isn't just an energy conversation. You also have to look at the geopolitics of the West with the US, but in particular in the Far East and China. And we're seeing now, just in the last few days, it's been bubbling along for a while. I think it's going to get a lot worse with the relationship that this government is fostering with China and the industrial policy that China has, not just internally, but on a geopolitical basis, to try and corner the market from an energy manufacturing point of view, where it is using the CCP, to subsidise their own manufacturers, never mind using cheap coal and other energy sources to do it, getting around tariffs. They're doing it in offshore wind as we speak, albeit they've already cornered that market. We've seen huge issues with the Chinese then putting pressure on the UK government with the embassy, and we're going to see more of that. We've seen some quite, I think, dodgy areas that the government have got into in some of the discussions around the nationalisation of British Steel and how that intersects with the politics of this as well. All of this means that the conversation has changed to the extent that what we started out on a journey to try and be a world leader in these technologies, create jobs that we can then export to the rest of the world and add GDP and add value to the UK as a manufacturing base, we didn't capture them. And we've got to accept that it is impossible for us to have a solar industry, an offshore wind industry, an onshore wind industry, a hydrogen industry. So therefore, we have to be realistic about that. And we're also in a new world, whether that be with the Ukraine, post-COVID, issues generally around UK manufacturing, that we have to be much more realistic on energy policy. And so, yeah, the circumstances have changed significantly. But I do go back to just a single point that I made in my opening remarks, is that doesn't mean that they shouldn't play a role in the UK energy mix. You know, there's some really interesting stuff, for example, that Octopus Energy are doing around being able to build homes with I think it's Miller Homes and a couple of the house builders, where they're building homes, and if you buy one of those homes, you're not paying any energy prices for 10 years, guaranteed. And they're able to do that around flexibility within the grid, where they kind of arbitrage the energy pricing. But you as a consumer, you're not paying any energy bills. So it's not to say we should be anti-renewables. I think the realism argument is really important, and just doing what works best. And like I said, that wasn't necessarily the case 10, 12, 15 years ago when we were starting out on this journey, but it's definitely the case now.
Thank you. And then just briefly before I come to audience Q&A, Nick, the polling on this has always been quite mixed, hasn't it? In general, net zero as a concept seems to be broadly popular. It becomes more complicated when you start costing it. But then, of course, zero per capita growth, when that's experienced as falling living standards and rising cost of living through inflation, which is largely driven by energy, is obviously very unpopular. How do you think this case can be made in terms of telling a story and a narrative to the public? Because it sounds very counterintuitive that expanding fossil fuel production and supply could be part of a journey to a future more abundant and more sustainable energy mix. So how can we explain this to target voters?
Well, you're right. I mean, as far as I know, the polling evidence shows that that net zero is popular. So making an argument against net zero at that sort of face value level is hard. But that's why it's really important that you set it in a proper context to explain what it is you're trying to do and why this has to be part of the mission to change the country's economic model. Because it is also true that people do understand that the country's economic model is broken and we do need change. But I think this is one of the problems with our politics and the way our politics are written about, which is to just look at polling and say, oh, well, the public think this, therefore we must do that. And obviously the reality of government is far more complex. And the public themselves know that there are trade-offs in decisions. It's just that those trade-offs are never really presented in those kinds of questions. So there are limitations to thinking along those lines. I just wanted to pick up a little bit on what Ben just said about missing some of the opportunities of supply chains with some of the decisions successive governments have made. I mean, in effect, we've made ourselves the first mover as customers but not producers, which is absolutely mad. Of course it can be a good thing to be a first mover if you're a producer, because you're building up your productive capacity, you're potentially creating export markets for the future, and so on. But if you're the customer first mover, all you're doing is paying higher bills because these are novel technologies. And I think this is part of the answer to your question. Part of our job in taking on this argument is the kind of old-fashioned political art of debate and argument. So one of the things that we're often told is we shouldn't worry about the fact that all these industries of the past, all these unfashionable things like, chemicals. I mean, who needs that, right? All these unfashionable things, we can replace them with green jobs. Now, I don't know if any of you have looked at the ONS website to see what the definition of green jobs actually means. So when Ed Miliband says, well, we're creating however many thousands of green jobs, well, on the ONS website, the numbers that he's citing, green jobs include workers collecting household waste, people who repair computers, people who treat sewage, people who work for environmental charities. We are literally counting the people who are lobbying for renewable subsidies as justification for renewable subsidies. Does that make sense? It doesn't make sense. If you look at the breakdown, about 50,000 jobs are actually in renewable energy. And if you take the amount that we're raising in subsidies through people's bills, that means for those 50,000 jobs, we're spending approximately £200,000 in subsidies per job. So let's take on these arguments. They sound great, green jobs. Mm-hmm. What's the reality? Dig into it, create the news stories, show our research, show our knowledge, and show that there's an alternative to what this government is doing, because it is ruinous.
Nick, thank you. I'm conscious of time. We have about 15 minutes left, so I'm going to come to Q&A now. Please raise your hand, wait for a microphone. Please address your question through me, and then I will allocate to the panel. Please do say your name and organisation or your constituency association, and please make it a question, and in charity, please make it short. Sir.
Yeah, thank you. Archie Campbell from Equinor. How do you see the future of carbon capture projects? Millions of kind of private capital have flown into those projects because of carbon budgets and investment certainty around that, and the work of the Committee on Climate Change, which has said that CCS is a necessity, not an option. And so the kind of second part of that is, if the Climate Change Act is replaced, what should it be replaced by?
Thank you very much. Who would like to take that?
I mean, I probably should, given that we've got carbon capture on Teesside.
Sure, go for it.
Equinor are a major investor in it. It's good to see the investment from a mayoral point of view. I'm not going to talk about the specific projects. I think it would be unfair, but it's another example of the technology is only being delivered for two reasons. One, we are approaching a carbon pricing mechanism, which we're aligning with the EU, which is even higher than our own, which basically means without carbon capture and storage, particularly in energy-intensive areas, to try and protect the limited number of jobs that we still have, the price of everything is going to go up, because you're going to be paying the carbon tax. And if you're not paying the carbon tax, you're paying the storers of the carbon to be able to put that carbon into that facility so you're not emitting. So there is a cost to that. So that means the cost of everything fundamentally goes up. The question is, do you want it to go up a little bit because you've got carbon capture and storage, because we have upcoming carbon taxes? Or do you want it to go up a lot by not having carbon capture and all businesses having to pay the higher levy on the carbon tax? And then the second issue of all of this is the reason that carbon capture has even got started in the UK at all is because, and I say this in the way that it's intended, because like I say, this investment is on Teesside, but absolutely obscene subsidies to make it happen. And the subsidy comes because all you're doing is de-risking it for the private sector. There is zero risk on the private sector in reality, or near zero risk in the private sector on carbon capture and storage projects in this country, because they have a direct guaranteed price from government for the next 25, 30 years, index linked, which no doubt I'd be surprised if they haven't already gone and capitalised and taken their money out of before they've started the project. I mean, it is also being project financed using the subsidy direct from government. So perversely, you have the UK taxpayer standing behind a 30-year contract that allows carbon capture to be built by a private business, and they're using your money to do it. And then they're making a profit over the next 30 years, index linked, which they can take to any bank in the world and get an excellent multiplier on that return. So that's separate from the technology and whether we need it in this current policy framework. And I think that's why it's so significant that the Conservative government have talked about repealing the Net Zero Act, because the question is, well, what does that actually mean? It sounds like, and what we heard from Claire yesterday is we would be abolishing that carbon tax. How does that work in a global market? How does it work with our European neighbours? There's still some detail to be worked out. But fundamentally, it's not a technology that stands on its own 2 feet. It's a cost technology. There is no way either for carbon capture to ever make money either, because it's storing a product that we don't want to be released, so it has to be costed to somebody, and it ultimately is costed to the consumer or the taxpayer if it's socialised. It's also fair to say, though, and this is where even Ed Miliband is on the extreme of this, even the IPCC reports around 2050 that help set this target that we're talking about repealing says that there is going to be a vast requirement for gas even in 2050, which a lot of the environmental lobbies refuse to accept. So you're even getting to a place now where you've got the extreme left on the environmental side who are anti-carbon capture and storage, which is literally written from the Bible that they follow on the 2050 target. You'll never be able to win that race politically, because you can never go far enough until we're basically living in caves, huddled around campfires, albeit that we weren't allowed to have campfires because we're burning wood, and therefore that'll be environmentally friendly. So the whole thing is an absolute mess. And I think what we need is just, again, let's go back to basics. What are we here to do? I think we should be here to reindustrialise and create jobs in the UK for national security, energy security, and for the well-being of our nation as a whole. I think we want to produce cheap energy. The simplest way of doing that is having more supply and not subsidising it through the taxpayer, because, and again, just very quickly, I want to touch upon this point about nuclear. There are projects that have been emerging over the last 2 or 3 years that don't require government subsidy. X-Energy, Centrica were announced during the Trump visit. They've been saying to government for the last couple of years, and I say that because they want to build this on Teesside. All they want is certainty over the regulatory framework. The government still, while they're talking about SMRs, haven't just said this is the regulation with which SMRs will take place. If we had that regulation published now, X-Energy would go to FID, they would raise private finance without a penny of subsidy, and they would deploy that on Teesside. And you can do that to get an energy technology started in places like Teesside or the Humber or potentially even South Wales, because you're matching that demand against the supply against the demand through PPAs and direct connections. And then once you get that ball rolling, you're not just ordering 2 or 3, you're ordering 15, 20. You get into, in effect, the modular build of SMRs, and then all of a sudden there's a cost comparative nature to be able to roll them out. So the model does work and exist, but you also have a major problem, and again, I'll ramble for ages, so I will stop at this point, but the thing that we haven't touched upon, and I'll go back to a Trussism, which is true, is the Treasury orthodoxy on all this. I mean, I've had conversations on nuclear, hydrogen, and offshore wind, where if you speak to senior government officials in the Treasury, their position is, why do we care where we have this in the UK? Why wouldn't we allow other nations to invest in their manufacturing facilities, and they can bear the cost of the technology and drive down the cost, and then they can sell it to us cheaply? That is, if you pull out Economics by Dummies 101 from Oxford University, it will tell you that's the right thing to do. But it's not the right thing to do, and that's often driven a lot of the politics through the Climate Change Act as well. So you've got and it goes back to Ryan's point. It's not just about cost; it's about the culture, it's about the regulation, it's about the process behind that. And until all of it's tackled, I don't think we'll get much further forward in general.
Thanks, Ben. I'm going to take a couple together now. So this gentleman at the back here, and then Lauren. And nice and brief, please.
Sure. My name's Will James. I work for Valero Energy Limited. We own and operate Pembroke Refinery down in West Wales. We employ thousands of people, support the employment of thousands of people. About 14% of UK transport fuels, but we are the world's largest independent refining company with most of our business in the US Gulf Coast. My question is, how can we be more like the US Gulf Coast? Some of this seems
like the US,
like the US Gulf Coast. So how can we be more like Texas? If you put it succinctly, Texas is an energy abundant area. Some of this debate is, how do we be more like China? And China seems like an almost impossible thing to replicate, particularly because of the political system. But in Texas, you've got energy abundance, you've got not just oil and gas, but renewables. And I think fundamentally what they've got in Texas is the cultural point which Ben's just touched on. How do we sort of reward people for wanting to do these things here? And how do we be more like Texas? How do we not be like California? Because California is...
I'm going to have to wind you up, I'm afraid.
We will be closing a refinery in California next year because that's just the opposite way.
All right, thank you. So how do we be more Texas? And Lauren?
Thanks. Lauren McKevitt, I run Morpeth Consulting, and I've just spent the last 7 months consulting for a pension fund. The Mansion House Accord commits the pension funds who've signed up to it to 5% in British markets, 10% in private markets overall. And there's a new line in the Pension Schemes Bill which will give the Pensions Minister the power to mandate investment in private markets and in British essentially infrastructure. How much danger, this is probably a question for Juliet actually, how much danger is the pensions industry in if the UK government doesn't reform both planning and how it brings on stream new energy, if it's forcing pension funds into those types of investments which may be non-profitable in the long term?
Thank you very much. So, is there a danger to the pensions industry from mandated unprofitable investments? Then we'll come back to Texas. Do you want to take that second one, Juliet?
On the one side, I think it's healthy for a country to try and get its domestic savings into domestic production, and most countries that have industry, that is exactly what they do. But obviously, if investment is fleeing your country, including your own savings, such as they are, you should probably look at why that is. So on the one hand, I don't have a problem with the government trying to get more domestic savings into the UK economy, but I do think that in isolation is a sort of financial repression that will probably end badly. On the Texas point, you need to allow people to get rewards for investment and to stop talking about windfall taxes as soon as things go up. And you need to deregulate. That's why Texas has laid on more solar in the last year than, this country has in 10.
Ryan, did you have anything to add on the how can we be more Texas?
Well,
not compulsory.
Yes, of course. So I think it's worth noting that ERCOT, Texas's grid, does have a nodal locational pricing system, which is a bit more responsive and does allow for the build-out of renewables with somewhat less subsidies, although there is still subsidies going on in Texas. Reforming the UK grid at this current time, when the government's bandwidth is already quite limited, is very challenging, especially since anyone with skin in the game, namely generators, utilities, and big consumers, say for Octopus, seem to be dead against any kind of zonal pricing reform. It is worth noting that energy abundance, which the US has, is not everything when it comes to reindustrialization. Despite the fact that the US, since about 2014, has had functional energy abundance, it has still, industrially speaking, been pretty stagnant. In fact, industrial production, if you look at sort of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, it's not where it was in 2006. And fundamentally, there is this other big problem around manufacturing, and that is the global glut in manufacturing, which is down to Chinese overcapacity and East Asian overproduction more generally. Because frankly, because of their particular model of capitalism, they are pursuing projects where the margins might be 2%, 1%, minus 2%, right? And they have a million ways in which they can draw out their borrowing and draw out their debts. And that's why, fundamentally, the tariffs are happening, okay? We can disagree with the tariffs and certainly with their efficacy, but that is why they are being pursued, because energy abundance, while essential, is not sufficient.
Thanks, Ryan. Two more really quickly. We'll take Sir and Madam there.
Hi, I've just looked up, and 40% of our grid right now is running on renewable energy. God, Freudian slip there.
Sorry, 40% of UK growth is...
40% of the UK grid is running on renewable energy.
Of the UK grid, yeah.
Yeah. These are on inflation-locked contract for differences. Is there a plan to get out of these? Is that actually possible without a sovereign default, which would obviously be very bad? Otherwise, we'll be locked in for 20 years, forever.
Okay, is there a plan to reform contracts for difference? And yes.
Hi, Alicia Zakrzewska from AD. I absolutely agree with the points about energy security and the importance of national energy supply. But one thing that I think hasn't been mentioned in this panel is the importance of heat. The UK wastes enough heat each year to heat the majority of our buildings. So I just really wanted to hear the panel's opinion on the future of heat policy, when we can harness waste heat from data centers, from industry, and geothermal. What's the future of heat policy?
Thank you very much. Nick, did you have any thoughts on contracts for difference and how that might be reformed, or anyone else?
Gavin, it's the skill of the chair to understand that you shouldn't ask a front bencher a question of a policy where it's not yet set.
I'm just trying to tease you.
It's obviously something that needs to be investigated as part of the work that will continue to be done after this conference. I mean, the point you make about how 40% of the power generation at the moment is renewable really sort of sums up, I think, the issue, because lots of advocates of renewables would say that's fantastic, but tomorrow it might be close to zero. And that intermittency is the problem, and it's why the costs that are presented to the public so often aren't real, because it doesn't take into account the balancing costs and the system costs and things like that. On the point about subsidies and contracts for difference, we are being tied into really long-term financial commitments. So the renewables obligation, which came in at the start of the century, just after, was closed by the last government, but we're still paying subsidies through it. And we'll be doing the same with contracts for difference. And Ed Miliband at the moment is signing up the country to extortionately expensive contracts for difference, which will be felt for many years into the future. As for what we do about that and the dilemmas you describe, that is above my pay grade.
Thanks very much, Nick. I'm afraid we are at time, so we're going to have to call it there. Thank you very much indeed for attending. I would like just to make a brief announcement, which is that on this very topic, Onward is going to be launching formally next month a new 3-year commission on exactly how to achieve UK energy abundance from a radically pragmatic perspective. It is our ambition to pull together not only bold and implementable recommendations, but an actual legislative plan for a future Conservative centre-right government. And so watch out for Onward's work in this space. The next Onward event is in 30 minutes' time, and that is with Helen Whately on rewiring the state. So that is everything to do with reforming the size and scope of government spending, so very, very salient and important issue. And later on at 5, we have an in-conversation with Chris Philp. So do come along to those. Thank you very much for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your conference.